Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 151. Well, stay tuned for Meredith Kline Applied. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux of Cornerstone Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Houston, Texas. Welcome back, Todd.
Hey, Chris, it's good to be back. Wasn't it a nice break, though?
It was nice. I hope that our listeners forgive us for taking a few weeks off, but it was nice to catch a little bit of a break there.
It was kind of nice to see that people were listening over the holidays. They were probably catching up on old episodes, but...
Yes, I've heard from more than one person that they were doing some catch-up, so that was nice.
But we're ready to go. This year we're going to consider applying. We're not going to go through any one book of Meredith's, but we're going to take his theology and apply it to different aspects of church life, as we'll start today, and I'm really excited about that. What about you?
Me too. We're going to be talking about two kingdoms, what today is known as two kingdoms. I should point out, before we even launch into this, that it wasn't really a phrase that Kline himself used. He liked to distinguish between the covenant of common grace and the covenant of grace, but that's really what David Van Drunen and others are talking about when they talk about the two kingdoms. And Todd and I were just talking before we went live that it seems like this year is going to give us absolutely no shortage of material to talk about in terms of this two kingdom theology. So really looking forward to it.
Did you want to do housekeeping before we start?
I guess so, yeah. So I'll just remind our listeners that we do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There you can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode. We would sure appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and to subscribe to the podcast on whatever you use to listen to it. Both of those things really help to boost our visibility to other people who are looking for good theological content in their podcasts. And finally, if you have the means to pitch in a little bit of money to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. And any amount that you can give is very much appreciated. It really is encouraging to Todd and me. And, another podcast that I was listening to recently even gave people an option for how to send in checks. It makes a little more work, but if you don't like the PayPal that we use and you'd prefer to send a check, just email glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com and I'd be happy to help you out with that option. So with the housekeeping out of the way, Todd, how should we get off the ground with our two kingdom discussion?
Well, the question for Meredith on two kingdoms, and I'm glad you brought that up, that he never used that phrase, two kingdom. But the question was, what is the jurisdiction and authority of the visible church? And so that's the key question, and Kline thought the Bible was very clear on the limits and of both the church's authority and jurisdiction. What can she do? What can she speak about? What are the limits? And that's what we would call two kingdom theology, is really trying to answer that question. Now, this particular context of two kingdom theology concerns the 1963 OPC General Assembly, where the OPC Missions Committee had established medical missions to Eritrea, which was a newer mission field, Eritrea, Africa. And so they were establishing a medical clinic, and they were now about to call men, or they had already started calling men as missionary doctors. Now, we're so used to that in our day, maybe we haven't even bothered to question it. But in that day, it raised a question whether, is it the church's authority, responsibility, or is it under its jurisdiction to establish a medical mission and to call men as missionary doctor. And so when that question came up at the General Assembly, there was a majority report. And that majority report, the answer was yes. The church is given this authority to establish medical missions as well as call men as missionary doctors. Then there was a minority report that said no. And the two authors of the minority report was a man named first Paul Wooley, so one of my personal heroes, who would never make it in the Reform camp today, by the way. And then Meredith Kline was the other one. And they answered no. And so what I'm going to do is sort of summarize the report, reading through a little bit of how they answered the majority. Go ahead.
Real quickly before we move forward, if my memory serves me correctly, By Oath Consigned is dedicated to Paul Wooley. I think he has that on the title page. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and one of the things Paul Wooley is known for is that he argued that the church should not have a statement on abortion. And it's important to remember also, and I don't necessarily agree with that, but the limited amount of information they had at the time. We didn't have such things as pictures or of what we knew scientifically. And you wonder if technology would have changed some of that. But you can read about that on the minority report when abortion came out. But Paul Wooley was definitely with Meredith on the limits of the church. So the first argument in answering the majority was dealing with how to frame the question. Because Meredith and Paul did not like how the majority framed the question. And they didn't feel it was representing their concern at all. So, for example, in the majority report, it says, is it a Christian duty to show compassionate concern for the physical as well as the spiritual well-being of one's neighbor, thus reflecting the compassion of the messianic redemption, which extends to the whole man, body, and soul? Now, Kline felt that question was sort of unfair because it did not really reflect the concern. And so they start the minority report by saying, that's not even the question we are raising. Nobody is denying that God cares for the whole person, body, and soul. And nobody is denying that it wasn't compassionate to care for people's physical well-being as well as spiritual. Kline would say, of course, that's the Christian's duty as we show compassion or concern. The question is about the authority of the church, not what Christians are to do individually with people or what we should care for. So he says that as soon as you frame the question that way, you're not dealing with the issue at hand. And it sort of puts us in a no-win situation because who would want to deny such a basic truth?
Exactly.
So Kline begins, of course we all agree God cares. That's not the question. And the report then, and I'm quoting from the majority, states, we are not to divorce the natural from the spiritual. And Kline responded, such a charge demonstrates the utter failure to read our report. Nobody is suggesting that we're divorcing the natural from the spiritual. Again, no one is suggesting that we as Christians do not care for people, body, and soul. Kline responded, because the OPC did not have its own seminary. Most of the churches did not run their own schools. And so Kline brought up logically, if a church did not run its own school, would you accuse them of divorcing the natural from the spiritual? And so simply not doing something in the common grace realm or for anything of this life as a visible church, we do not assume in those cases you're divorcing the natural from the spiritual. You're simply stating that's not the role of the church.
Right.
And so Kline starts off by clarifying that we are not disagreeing with these general truths. And Kline writes, the issue is not whether individual Christians can do things like run hospitals or feed the homeless. He says, of course they can. The question is, what is the biblical warrant for the church as an institution in ministering the affairs of a medical establishment and as officers of the church? And another way to say that is, what is the warrant for the church to be in charge of common cultural causes like hospitals, medicines, clinics? And so Kline would not be against individual Christians starting things, but it would be a common grace and endeavor that would be under the normal rules of medicine and that government. And so Kline then writes that he's not even suggesting that it's wrong for the church to contribute diaconally to suffering in the area of the mission, that whatever the area is. But the question at hand, is medical work a continuing function of the church, like we say preaching is, or the administration of the sacraments? And so Kline sums up the question this way, quote, "This being the case, the evidence which is adduced in alleged support of the thesis that God has nevertheless assigned the cultural task of medicine to the church, as well as to other institutions, must be unambiguous. The evidence presented to the General Assembly by the committee is anything but compelling," unquote. And so again, Kline says, if you're going to make a case that God has given the church the responsibility to establish clinics and do medicine as part of her calling, then you have to prove that from the Bible, not just simply state general truths that Christians should care for people as a whole. The question is a little more specific than that. And so the Minority Report said, we have not seen good biblical argument that this is the church's jurisdiction. And so he starts off in the first section of the report reframing the question so everybody can focus on why they think this is wrong. What are your thoughts on that before we get to the actual arguments?
I mean, I appreciate where he went with the diaconate. What strikes me as I was listening to you summarize that is that it's the deacons who are responsible for caring for the physical needs of people that we really see for the first time in Acts chapter 6. And it also seems like, at least from my reading of the New Testament, which granted, I mean, I got from many people that I respect at Westminster Seminary, California, but the diaconate seems to be primarily responsible for the people in their own local congregation. The world is by definition not the people in the local congregation. And it's not that we're being stingy in saying that we won't help the world. And I mean, from what you just said in the summary there, it's not that Kline is opposed to even using diaconal funds to help people outside the local congregation. But I guess another issue that comes up here is, like you were talking about in terms of individual Christians helping out in certain situations to help people with their physical needs. Not everybody is gifted in every possible way to help every physical need. I mean, I'm not trained medically. I really couldn't help somebody who's having a heart attack other than to call 911 or something like that. I'm not super skilled in terms of engineering or carpentry. If someone said, hey, an earthquake just leveled my house, can you come and help me? Well, I mean, I'm an extra pair of hands. I can help you move things, but I'm not going to be a lot of help in terms of rebuilding your house.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because Kline's going to deal with that question, because what about those who are medically gifted?
Okay.
And can cure bodies? Is that something we can look at as someone we can call to that office? That's the question. That's the one you raise. I think what I found interesting in this opening discussion is how often I hear these same type of things where they don't understand Kline's view and they assume that means you don't care about things.
Yes.
We hear that all the time. And, because you don't think the church should do a particular thing or preach on it, they assume that means you don't care about it. And that was, Kline felt that was really unfair, because there's a lot of things in this world we care about, but we don't preach about.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of things that Christians do and should do that we don't preach about. And because it's not clearly in the Word. And so this idea that, well, you either take our position or it means you don't believe we care for the body, Kline says, you're starting off with a very unfair accusation that does not have to do with what we're really asking about. So I like that he clears that up right from the start in his minority report before he deals with the majority's actual arguments.
Amen.
Which we can get to now. You want to do that?
Let's do that.
Okay, so the first argument from the majority report is that in Jesus' ministry, as well as in the apostles' ministry, not only do we have the saving of souls, but we have the healing of bodies. And obviously, these were supernatural healings. And so the majority's argument that we see then that the church, if the apostles were doing this, then the church has warrant to continue in the ministry of healing bodies as well as souls. Kline argues here that those healings of Jesus and the apostles were special signs that were redemptive, historically contexted. They were there for a certain reason in redemptive history to confirm divine revelation. That's the very purpose of the miracles. And we see that, of course, in Hebrews 2, that they were signs to confirm the authority of the apostles. And so whenever men were bringing new revelation from God, they were accompanied by signs. We see that, of course, with Moses, etc. But we especially know that Christ himself was prophesied that the way you would know he's the Messiah is through the signs and the miracles. And of course, we're told that in Hebrews 2 about the apostles. So Kline says the healing of the bodies had two purposes. One, in that age of redemptive history, to confirm this new divine revelation both Christ and the apostles were bringing. There's no more new revelation, so there'd be no more reason for that type of ministry of healing. And the second point would be, Kline says, is when the bodies were healed, not only did that signify and symbolize the healing of our souls, but it was an eschatological promise. It was a looking ahead when our bodies would be renewed and perfected. That was included in the atonement, but it was looking ahead to the return of Christ. And so Kline argues you cannot use that argument to suggest that the signs continue in a post-apostolic ministry. And if you say that, then you're dealing with medicine that is fallible. In other words, our medical procedures are often unsuccessful. And so unsuccessful medicine cannot be a sign. The signs were actual healing that worked every time.
Right.
And so those were unique. And that's why they had the authority they did. They actually performed exactly what they intended to do. He says you can't connect that to the way we heal today, which we can do anything we want and say it's in the name of Christ, but it can be completely unsuccessful. Therefore, it wouldn't be a sign, and it wouldn't even be any type of continuation of those signs. And so his first argument ends with, there's no warrant then for the church to establish medical clinics as a continuation of the signs of Jesus and the apostles. Matter of fact, Kline says those healings actually took away the need for medicine.
Right.
Because they were supernatural. And so it was a very spurious connection, Kline says, to connect the healing ministry of Jesus and the apostles with the church establishing missionary doctors. That was his response, his first response to the majority's arguments. What are your thoughts?
My thought is that Kline is not alone here. I remember Herman Ritterboss in The Coming of the Kingdom also arguing that Jesus's healing miracles were a foretaste of the new creation. He didn't really use the language of intrusion, but it was almost like in Jesus's miracles, the new creation was intruding into the first century, not in its ultimate form, because obviously people who were healed would still die. Even Lazarus, who was raised from the dead, died again. So it wasn't the permanence of the new creation, but it stands in stark contrast to what medical doctors are doing. Medical doctors, as far as I can tell, are only alleviating the effects of the common curse, and that's very different from a picture of the new creation. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead and finish if you need.
Well, alleviating the common curse is not really the mandate that's given to the church either.
Right.
We're simply called to call people to faith in Christ out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of God, and to administer the sacraments. And that's just not what medical doctors are doing.
It's interesting when you think of Acts 3 and the man who needed money because he was so poor at the temple, and Peter says, "Silver and gold have I not, but
here's what I do have."
Yeah, and what he has is the gospel.
Right.
So, and again, Kline or we are not denying that we help people physically. Again, the question, of course, is the role of the church in establishing what missions is. And so, and I would just say that I'm certain the men who were authors of the majority report also believed that the signs confirmed Christ and the apostles' authority, and they were eschatological signs. But they would go beyond that and say there's a third way to look at the signs as a continuation that we can do today. And Kline says, no, that's the illegitimate way to look at them.
Mm-hmm.
We should see them exactly as the Bible used them. So now the second argument of the majority is, and I'll read from their report, nor may be it denied that the church today has also been given gifts of healing. These gifts are fundamentally different in nature than the miraculous gifts possessed by some in the apostolic age, but nevertheless they are gifts from God to the church. And so Kline and Paul then responded this way. Well, okay, it's true that physicians are gifted to heal, but plumbers are also gifted to fix pipes. If you're going to use that argument, dog catchers are gifted to catch dogs. But do we consider these things spiritual gifts to enhance the body? Are they evangelical gifts in the sense of something we ordain because of these gifts? Who do we ordain for the ministry? People with gifts in the common realm or people with gifts for ministry?
Right.
And so Kline says the argument that simply that they are gifted is not really a way to argue that the church then has the authority to establish medical missions. And again, he reminds them in the report that the healings in the Bible and the gift of healing was fundamentally different from having a natural medical ability or talent. And so making that connection, he says, is really not logical. Because it's not just that they are different in their supernatural ability, but they're different in the sense that what those gifts, healing gifts, were used for in the history of redemption. And so Kline argues that if a medical missionary is a full-time missionary that is now ordained because of a natural gift of being able to do medicine, then what we've done is we've created a new office for the church. Whether you're 2 office or 3 office, Kline says now you're saying you're 4 office.
Right.
And so now you have the gift of medicine. You have the gift of being a doctor. And he says, and simply calling a medical missionary a missionary, that word then becomes too obscure. He says there's nothing in our book of church order which explains what a medical missionary even is. That there's no office in the book of church order called a medical missionary. At least in the OPC book of church order, there are 3 offices: pastor, elder, and deacon. And so he says, if you start sending medical missionaries, you've created a new office. Are you going to rewrite the BCO? And so the majority wanted to argue from Acts 6, and Kline's first response is, well, it's unclear what exactly Acts 6 is suggesting. He's suggesting even if it is deacons, which is not quite clear they were exactly our modern deacons, they certainly weren't given a office of healing in that sense. It's not a special variety of deacon. But he notes also in James 5 that James says, when you're sick, call the elders to come pray. So even in the early church, there's no office of a healer, whether supernatural or natural. They're to go to the elders, and the elders are to pray. But they were not medically trained.
Right.
And so it seems the early church didn't see this type of office continuing. And so Kline summarizes answering the second point, quoting him, however, since there is no biblical evidence of deacons or any others practicing ordinary medicine as an official ecclesiastical function, what the modern church has actually done is invent the new office of the ecclesiastical medic.
That's an interesting phrase there at the end, because, are we going to examine our medical missionaries to make sure that they're sound theologically and that they can cure souls as well as bodies?
Right. Do medical missionaries have to go to seminary and get an MDiv?
Right.
Or do
they need to be theologically sound?
Right. And so Kline says you create something new that we really don't have in the history of the church, that you almost have to rewrite what your view of office is if you call an actual medical missionary, not just a doctor who goes out, but you actually send and support as a missionary.
Mm-hmm.
And so that leads to the third and final argument that Kline responds to. And the argument from the majority is this: the function of medicine is, according to the committee's insistence, a properly ecclesiastical function. Therein, the committee would find the justification for its policy of medical missions. And Kline's response is, first, by what standard is this work to be performed and governed? And you brought that up earlier. If the Word of God is our standard for what we do as missionaries, matter of fact, Sola Scriptura, especially for the office of minister or missionary, we only look to the Word as our guide for what to do, what is missionary work. Kline writes, if there's such thing as a medical missionary, what is their standard for how to do their job? If it's not from the Bible, then what? And he asked the question, how will the church discipline someone if they're not fulfilling their responsibilities in a right way? How do you know what the right way? I mean, the rest of us aren't even qualified. So who's qualified to judge the qualifications of what that person is doing?
True.
You can't look at the Word and say he's not doing what the Bible says. So now you need an authority structure with medical qualifications above him. But what standard are they going to use to decide if he's fulfilling his responsibilities correctly? If the church is not qualified. And if the church is not qualified and you need professionals, well, then Kline writes, the Scripture is no longer our sole authority and rule for ministry.
Right.
And so his summary then is this statement: thus, when the church usurps to itself from the sphere of human culture the function of medicine, it involves itself in the relativism, the uncertainties, and the fallacies of expert human opinion, and repudiates the character of absolute divine authority that is the glory of its true ministry. So you're really using human wisdom to guide exactly what missionary work is for this special group of people.
So true.
Which is kind of scary because the church has to oversee that.
Yeah, so I really appreciate that he brings up Sola Scriptura and sets it over against what would have to be the case in order to ordain these medical missionaries. And it also struck me as you were talking about that, I'm sure there are so many other issues that we could talk about, but the one that came to mind first was, for instance, vaccines. And Christians are divided over that. And how do we adjudicate that question? I mean, obviously parents get to make the decision whether their children receive them or not, but how would the church even decide whether one medical missionary who wants to give vaccines and another medical missionary who doesn't want to give vaccines, which one is right?
Exactly. And if we're not qualified to make those decisions, then who's making them?
Right.
And then the church no longer has authority over its own missionaries. And so Kline gives, I think, some really good arguments against this idea. And he closes with a few points of his own, I should say their own. And he writes that the church must also be ready to submit then, if you're going to take the majority's view, to the interference of the state in its own proper ecclesiastical functioning, in a way clearly prejudicial to the prerogatives of Christ as head of the church. In other words, it's the government who decides how doctors are qualified, how they're licensed, who can operate as a physician, what medical practices are allowed and what's not allowed. These are all decisions of the state, not the church. And so if we create something called a medical missionary, whatever country they're in, they have to be submissive to the state's decisions on medical matters as far as what's allowed. And so what you're doing is you're allowing the state to come in and making decisions on things that are clearly prerogatives of Christ through his church on what missionary work is. We don't let the state tell us what to preach.
Right.
So if we don't let the state tell us what to preach, how would we allow the state to decide who's allowed to be a genuine doctor or not, which that is their role. And so he says it's a mess when it comes to licensing and qualifications, medical practices. And so then he writes, surely the church that submits to such state interference has thereby removed itself from under the exclusive lordship of Christ as king in a special sense of the church. And thus we are guilty of giving unto Caesar that which belongs only unto God.
That's a great point.
And so let me close with this final paragraph in their minority report. Then I'll ask your thoughts on it. In summary, the committee's policy of medical missions involves our church in the contradiction of the foundational biblical principles of church polity, the principles of the kingship of Christ, and the sole authority of the scriptures. And if this judgment is correct, it of course confirms the conclusion stated above that the committee's claim to have found biblical warrant for its policy is not valid. Should the General Assembly judge this analysis of the question at issue to be sound, it may not allow any considerations of expediency, voiced though they may be out of the urgency of Christian compassion and of the immediacy of contact with human misery on the mission field, to deter it from instructing the Committee on Foreign Missions to terminate its present medical missions program and to adopt a new policy on this matter consonant with the scriptures.
Mm.
In other words, that was pretty long. Even though there's suffering out there and it looks like there's a lot to do as far as helping people medically, and it seems like since we've already begun it, we should just continue it. Kline says if that's not what the Bible teaches, we should abandon the program and stick with the scripture's call and mandate to the church, is how he ended it. Now, I think everybody probably is aware that because it's a minority report, that means they lost.
Right.
And it means they didn't convince enough people. And so, of course, and by the way, that medical missions ended up closing because of other problems in Eritrea. But certainly the majority of the day did not believe that Kline was correct or was not convinced. And so any thoughts? I want to bring up one more point about Meredith after this, but any thoughts on this issue that come to mind?
I mean, this is only in deference to certain listeners that I know we have who would call themselves anarchists, that it is the case that today the state decides who is qualified to practice medicine and who is not. But I mean, I guess there's nothing built into the world as God created it that means that it has to be that way. I guess there could be some other non-state entity that decided whether someone was qualified. But I mean, the fact still remains, even if it was some non-state group that was deciding who can be doctors, it's still not the church. This church is not equipped to decide who can be a doctor and who can't. And I guess that was the main point I was going to make there.
Yeah, I want to close with this. I think this will be helpful when we think on these issues. Somebody once asked Meredith, what do you do now that you've lost the argument? And even though we don't agree, those of us who agree with you, what do we do about all these medical missions that we don't believe in? And Kline's answer was, you support them.
Mm.
Because Kline was a churchman. And Kline held to the theology of the cross. And the theology of the cross is you don't win everything in this life. And when you lose, you don't start a new denomination because you lose an argument. Kline was not interested in a two-kingdom denomination because he lost at General Assembly.
Mm.
So Kline actually says, if this is what the church wants, we don't agree with it, it's still you support it. That's your denomination. And I thought that was now, of course, if you actually denied the gospel, he wouldn't say support it, but
Right.
At this point it was more a difference in jurisdiction in question. So he would say you be a good Presbyterian and you support it. And it's important to know that about Meredith, so you get the proper view of the man, that almost every argument Meredith ever had on a public level, he lost.
Right. And I appreciate this point so much that you're making, because unlike so many other theologians that I can think of, here he's actually living out the theology that he's teaching in the classroom, that suffering is the hallmark of the Christian life. And he went for it. He made the best argument that he could in this minority report, and he still lost. And he continued on. Suffering was not going to keep him from continuing to do the work that God had called him to do in the classroom.
Yes. Yep. So just looking ahead, next week we're going to expand upon this and say we've only dealt with one particular instance of where this two-kingdom theology affects the church, and that is medical missions. And now we're going to expand that to areas of politics and public morality and culture for the next couple of weeks. So we're going to take Kline's theology and bring it up to speed what the church is talking about today. So we'll have probably 2 more weeks on Kline's two-kingdom theology applied. But that's just a taste of where he tried to apply it at the denominational level.
Okay. And we reserve the right to come back to this and apply it here and there as we see fit, right?
Of course.
Well, thank you, Todd. I really, really enjoyed that discussion. All right. Well, we would love to hear what you think, dear listener. You can email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux. The podcast itself is at glorycloudpod. I'm also on Instagram as at Machen Guy. And you can also join the discussion over at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast and they can get you added. And Todd and I will be back again with more of this next week.